Hello again, everyone. I'm sorry the lecture got interrupted by a phone call that I had to take. So, this is part two of the lecture I was just working on related to the story of the judges, which we have not really gotten into yet. But I'm going to continue where I left off. I believe I mentioned that the children of Israel um, did not return back from exile until King Cyrus of Persia defeated the Babylonians, where they were in exile for 50 years. And this took place in the 6th century under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, who helped organize rebuilding the walls and the Temple of Jerusalem. Okay, back to the period of the Judges. Now that the Israelite tribes had conquered the Promised Land under the leadership of Joshua, with the exception of the coastal plain, that is, where the Philistines continued to live, the time had come for them to organize themselves into some kind of political entity. And it's important to understand that the individuals in these tribes, their primary allegiance was to their tribe, not to Israel as a whole. So they were an independent bunch. As I think I mentioned, Joshua, as he lay dying at age 110, exhorted them to remain faithful to the covenant God made with them through Moses on Mount Sinai on the way to the Promised Land. And they all said in unison, "We will follow the Lord." Okay, but what shape is that going to take? Is there going to be some kind of central government for the 12 tribes? Once the Promised Land was conquered and Joshua helped divide up the territory among the 12 tribes, each had their own territory, and each existed as an independent group. But there was no central government that held them together or that had any authority over all 12 tribes. Now, the primary problem that this presented to them at the time was, like I said, their enemies were many, and some of those enemies had designs on the land that they occupied, including the Philistines and their neighbors to the east and to the north. So the primary problem was defense and security. So what would happen again and again is that an individual tribe would be attacked by some external enemy. In fact, sometimes there was even internal strife among the tribes themselves. More often, it was an external enemy who would attack one of the tribes, and the tribes did not have the wherewithal to defend themselves against these attackers. They needed the help of the other tribes. So what they relied on was people who were called judges. Now, judges were not formally chosen from among the tribes. Judges simply arose out of one of them. They were charismatic leaders. They were people who inspired allegiance. They were people who others would want to follow, and they would organize people from among as many tribes who were willing to contribute fighters as possible to fend off the attack of these foreign invaders. So what essentially this was called was a tribal confederacy. In other words, they each existed as independent tribes, but they did so under the promise that they would all govern themselves by the law of Moses. So it was a kind of an entity that lacked any central authority, but which by consent agreed to govern themselves by the same laws. Okay, so the book of Judges is about these charismatic leaders, okay? And these stories were collected and handed down from generation to generation. We don't have independent corroboration from outside of the Bible about these folks. So we rely on the biblical text itself to tell the story. And so that's what we're going to do, and I'm not going to go through each and every one of the judges. I'm going to pick a few of them because the way the story is told, okay, and recall that these stories were not written down. Perhaps they were started at the time of King Josiah. But this document was not completed until during or after the exile in the 6th century. So the document that we have now, entitled The Judges, was composed at that time. And it was done not simply to retell the history of Israel during this period. It was done to inspire hope in the people of Israel so that during times of trouble, they would turn to God for help. It was a document that was historical, but historical with a message that encouraged them to rely on God's help when they ran into difficulty, particularly at a time when they were under attack by a foreign enemy. Now, some of these stories are extremely graphic. They reflect the age in which they occurred. It was a very chaotic time for Israel, and some of the violence is quite graphic. It's probably not something you want to read as a bedtime story for your children. Definitely not that. But it does give us a glimpse into the way life was at that time for the people of Israel. Okay, so how were the stories told? What was the basic outline that organize the story of each judge. So the book of Judges is part of, and I may have mentioned this, I can't recall, is part of the Deuteronomistic history, which is the story of the history of Israel contained in the books from Joshua all the way through 2 Kings. And it's told with the interpretive key that the historians used in telling the story was the book of Deuteronomy, which is why it's called the Deuteronomistic history. Okay, and recall that in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses said, "Obey God and things will go well for you, and God will protect you and you will prosper. Follow foreign gods and God will abandon you to your enemies and things will not go well for you at all." So that exhortation that so long as they remain faithful to the Mosaic covenant, things would go well. Or, if they don't, things would not go well. That is the way the story is told. So during the period of the Judges, when the people disobey God and fall into idolatry and break the covenant that they had with God through Moses, the Mosaic covenant, why the enemies of Israel get the better of them, just as Moses warned them. However, when they cry out to God and ask for help and repent of their idolatry, God intervenes, sends a judge. The judge organizes resistance and defeats the enemy. And that's the way the story goes for each and every one of the judges. So let me just summarize it in this way. Each of the stories of the judges follows this outline. Number one, the people sin against God in some way, shape, or form. Number two, God gives them up to their enemies, and they suffer for it. Number three, the people end up defeated and humiliated. Number four, the people cry out to God for help. They repent of their sin. Number five, God sends a judge to save the day, and their enemies are routed. And number six, there's a period of peace and prosperity for a period of time, and then that lasts for a while, and unfortunately, after the period of peace and prosperity, the people end up disobeying God again, and the same outline repeats itself yet again. The first judge in the book that is recorded is a guy named, let me look it up here because I want to read you. That's a very short, it's a one-paragraph history of what happens here. This is Othniel, and here's the way it reads. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, forgetting the Lord their God and worshipping the Baals and the Asheroths. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of King Cushan something or another of Aram Naharim. And the Israelites served Cushan Rashathim, 8 years. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the Israelites, who delivered them, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave King Cushan-Rathaim of Aram into his hands, and his hand prevailed over Cushan-Rathaim. So the land had rest 40 years. Then Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. There's the recording of the first king. Second king, a guy named Ehud. It starts out this way. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord strengthened King Eglon of Moab against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. In alliance with the Ammonites and the Amalekites, he went and defeated Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. So the Israelites served King Eglon of Moab 18 years. But then the Israelites cried out to the Lord. The Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. The Israelites sent tribute by him to King Eglon of Moab. Ehud made for himself a sword with 2 edges and a cubit of length, and he fastened it on his thigh under his clothes. Then he presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent the people who carried the tribute on their way. But he himself turned back at the sculptured stones near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. So the king said, Silence! And all his attendants went out from his presence. Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in the cool roof chamber and said, I have a message from God for you. So he rose from his seat. Then Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into Eglon's belly. And the hilt went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, etc., etc. And of course, then that king was defeated, and then there was a period, once again, of calm and prosperity for the Israelites. Well, that's the way it's going to go. Okay. Next week, we are going to complete the book of Judges by looking at the stories of Gideon and Samson, the most famous ones, perhaps Deborah. That's where we'll go from here. But for now, we're done. So bye for now, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.